Before half of Bellweather, Bank Director Alistair Vane placed Clara Whitmore's father's account book on the courthouse steps and called her a debtor's daughter living above her station. By sundown, her family home belonged to the bank. In exchange for surrendering every challenge to the debt, Clara received the keys to Bellweather Baths, a condemned building with cracked marble, sinking floors, and no legal water supply. Clara had spent years copying pipe surveys for her late father, so she knew a dead system should be silent. Yet in the abandoned pump room, one sealed copper pipe shuddered beneath her hand, carrying cold, clear water uphill. Vane had ordered demolition in 30 days. Whatever he feared inside the bathhouse, Clara had 1 month to find it. The humiliation had begun that morning under a sky the color of old pewter. Vane had chosen the courthouse steps because market day filled the square. Farmers, mill hands, and shopkeepers watched as his clerk read out a debt of £418 and 12 shillings, secured, he claimed, by the brick house where Clara had been born. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, had been dead for 5 months and could neither explain the entry nor deny the wavering signature beneath it. Clara had denied it for him. Edmund measured every line before he drew it and crossed every 7 with a short horizontal stroke. The signature in Vane's book had an uncrossed 7 in the date and a flourish her father never used. Vane closed the account book before anyone else could look closely. "Grief is cruel to the memory, Miss Whitmore." Henry Alden, the young solicitor who had come at Clara's request, whispered that an injunction would cost more than the £11 and 7 shillings she possessed. The bailiffs already held a writ. If she refused Vane's settlement, they would empty the house while the matter dragged through court. If she signed, she would lose the right to dispute the debt in a private civil action. The paper did not, Alden murmured, excuse fraud or extinguish the rights of any public trust. At the time, the distinction felt as useful as an umbrella after a drowning. Clara signed because she could not bear to see her mother's walnut chest thrown into the square. Vane allowed her 1 trunk, her father's leather survey case, and until sunset to leave. He gave her the bathhouse deed, with the air of a man presenting a dead rat by its tail. Bellweather Baths stood beyond the northern edge of town, where the last row of cottages met Marlow Hill. Built of gray limestone, it had a central pediment blackened by soot and 2 low wings surrounding a weed-choked courtyard. Boards covered most of the windows. A rusted chain hung across the front steps beneath a council notice, declaring the building dangerous. Vane arrived as Clara broke the chain with the key he had given her. "You are not to admit the public," he said. "The west pool floor is unsound. The council's men will begin taking the roof slates on the 14th of May. A demolition order is not permission to enter property you have conveyed." His eyes moved to her father's survey case. "There is nothing here worth measuring." He offered her £5 to return the deed. The offer was almost half the money she had left. When she refused, he smiled for the benefit of the driver waiting by his carriage, but the skin around his mouth tightened. Inside, plaster lay in damp islands across the tiled floors. The ticket hall smelled of pigeons, lime, and stagnant drains. A painted sign still separated men from women, though both doors opened into darkness. Clara chose the women's corridor, where rain had entered through broken roof glass and fed a small garden of nettles. Her father had taught her to begin a survey at the boundary and work inward. But daylight was failing. She found the pump room by following iron pipes through the cellar. The municipal inlet had been capped and stamped in 1862, exactly as the council schedule described. Every gauge was filmed with green corrosion. Every wheel valve resisted her hand. Then she felt the tremor in the copper branch line. It ran from beneath a stone valve table, crossed the north wall, and disappeared through brickwork toward the hill. When Clara pressed her ear to it, she heard a muted blow, a pause, and another blow, steady as a distant heart. She opened a narrow test cock. Clear water struck her knuckles hard enough to cut the skin against the brass. She shut it at once and tasted one drop from her fingertip, only to judge whether it was brackish. It was cold and faintly mineral, without the bitter tang of the town main. She tied a strip of linen around her hand and held her lamp close to the valve table. Beneath dirt and verdigris, a small oval plate bore two engraved initials, M.V. Below them were the figures 3, 2, 1 and a line marking 22 feet of head. Clara set her father's pressure gauge against the test cock. The needle rose, trembled, and settled. The pipe was not holding the last water of a dead system. Something was feeding it at that very moment. She spent her first night in the old ticket office with her trunk against the door. Rain tapped through the damaged roof into bowls she had placed beneath the leaks. Each time she drifted toward sleep, the hidden pipe struck twice under the floor, followed by a softer returning knock. At first light, Clara walked the perimeter with a measuring chain, compass, and her father's plane table. Bellweather Baths was worse by day. Ivy had opened joints in the east parapet. 2 roof trusses above the men's warm room were bowed, and a section of plaster ceiling had fallen across the shallow pool. The boiler chimney leaned 3 inches beyond its safe line. No responsible surveyor would have opened the whole building. The land, however, did not match the deed. Vane's conveyance described a rectangular parcel 160 feet from the courtyard gate to the north boundary. Clara measured 171 feet before her chain met the mossy wall at the foot of Marlow Hill. 11 feet of ground existed on the land but not on the written schedule. Along that strip, the grass stayed green despite a dry April, and 3 flat stones formed a line beneath the weeds. On the middle stone, someone had carved the same oval she had seen on the pump room plate. "That mark has troubled better people than you." Clara turned. An elderly man stood outside the gate with a sack of kindling on his shoulder. He was short and broad, with white whiskers and a left hand missing the end of its smallest finger. "Thomas Reed," he said. "Bath attendant. When there was a bath to attend." He had worked there from the age of 14 until the council closed the building after a boiler beam failed. The official account said the water supply had become too costly and the masonry unsafe. Thomas said no one had died in the failure. But Vane's father, then treasurer of the Baths Committee, had insisted repair would bankrupt the town. "Why bring kindling to an empty building?" Clara asked. Thomas looked past her toward the green strip. Old habits. She did not trust habits that came with sacks and no explanation. She searched the kindling before allowing him inside. He accepted the insult without complaint and showed her which ticket office stove drew safely. He also pointed out a hand pump in the courtyard, its handle chained down by council order. "That one ran sweet when every well in Tanner's Row turned foul," he said. "Your father remembered." Clara stopped unrolling her bedding. "You knew my father came here?" Thomas's gaze went to the leather survey case. "Last autumn. 3 visits. Perhaps 4. He asked after old pipe runs and the name Miriam Vale. Then Mr. Vane heard of it, and your father told me to keep my mouth shut until he had proof." "Proof of what?" He never said. The admission angered her more than an invented answer would have. Thomas had possessed one of her father's final secrets while she sat at Edmund's bedside. Believing fever had made him restless. She asked Thomas to leave. Before he did, he set the kindling beside the stove and told her the bank had written to every mason and plumber in Bellweather, warning that work at the baths would not be paid. That afternoon proved him right. 3 roofers declined her coins after learning the address. A 4th offered to strip the lead and slates as payment, which would have left the building open to the sky. Clara bought canvas, lime, lamp oil, and 2 second-hand buckets instead. She braced the ticket office ceiling with timber scavenged from broken changing stalls, patched the least dangerous leaks, and marked the unsafe rooms with red chalk. For 6 days she measured alone. The surviving council plan showed 48 feet from the women's plunge pool to the north wall. Her chain gave 57. A corridor or chamber 9 feet wide had vanished from the drawing. She tapped walls, inspected floor vents, and crawled beneath rotten benches until her knees bruised. Every sound was muddied by hollow service ducts. On the 7th morning, she found Thomas outside the gate again. This time he carried no kindling. He held a narrow receipt folded into oilcloth. Edmund Whitmore had paid him 8 shillings the previous October for clearing the upper screen and observing the ram. Her father's careful signature ended the line. The receipt did not explain what the ram was or where the upper screen lay, but on its reverse, Edmund had drawn 3 descending steps, followed by 1 rising line. "Why did you not bring this to the courthouse?" Clara demanded. "Because Mr. Vane had the account book, the magistrate, and 6 men willing to say your father owed him money. I had a scrap of paper and a promise." "A promise to whom?" "Your father. If the bank took the baths, I was to burn this. If anyone else became the lawful owner, I was to give it over." Vane had transferred the building to silence her. Instead, he had satisfied the condition Edmund had left behind. Clara admitted Thomas, though not yet into her confidence. Together they lifted the chain from the courtyard pump. The leather cup had dried to a hard ring, and the pivot pin was bent. Thomas expected her to force it. She dismantled the head, soaked the cup, straightened the pin over a charcoal brazier, and packed the gland with waxed flax from her father's case. By dusk, the handle moved. The pump brought up nothing. Thomas seemed stricken, but Clara had learned something. The shaft descended 12 feet and ended dry. The clear copper line did not feed the courtyard pump directly. Whatever kept it pressurized followed a separate course. She needed money to follow it. Her £11 had fallen below 7, and the demolition deadline had lost a week. Mrs. Agnes Pike, who ran a laundry in Tanner's Row, provided the first paid work. Her yard flooded every wash day, and 2 builders had blamed the slope. Clara measured the drain, discovered that a later brick channel rose 4 inches before reaching the street, and redesigned it to fall around the coal shed. Mrs. Pike watched Clara set each level peg and stopped addressing her as the bank's unfortunate young lady. "Can you do the work?" she asked. "I can set it out. Mr. Reed can lay the channel if you hire him." Thomas had not laid drains in 12 years. He worked slowly, but his joints were sound. Mrs. Pike paid Clara £1 6 shillings, and Thomas 12. More important, she told her customers that Edmund Whitmore's daughter understood water better than men who advertised the fact. Small commissions followed: a blocked dairy culvert, a cracked rain cistern, a yard pump drawing sand. Clara restored one dry corner of the ticket hall as an office and nailed a modest card to the gate. C. Whitmore, drains, levels, and water surveys. Someone tore it down the first night. Mrs. Pike painted another on a scrap of slate and fixed it with 4 iron screws. At the baths, Clara tested the clear pipe water as far as her equipment allowed. She evaporated a measured sample and found little residue. Silver nitrate produced only a faint cloud, suggesting no heavy salt contamination. She boiled another sample beside water from Tanner's Row. The town water left a brown rim and a sour odor, while the pipe sample remained clear. She would not call it safe without an independent analyst, but it was no common drain. By comparing pressure at dawn, noon, and evening, she found the head scarcely changed. A reservoir alone would have fallen. Some mechanism replenished it. The regular knock suggested a hydraulic ram, an old machine that used the fall of one stream to force a smaller quantity upward without steam or fuel. The idea explained Edmund's sketch. 3 descending steps. 1. Rising line. It did not explain where the machine stood, who had kept its intake clear, or why the pipe passed through 9 feet missing from every official plan. Thomas led her to the boiler room and showed her an old pattern in the encaustic floor tiles. 5 black diamonds repeated between red borders. Near the north wall, the sequence changed. 3 diamonds descended like stairs. 1 rose above them. The pattern was so subtle that generations of wet feet had passed over it without question. Clara laid Edmund's receipt beside the tiles. The marks matched. She followed the rising diamond to a cracked marble bench. Its end panel carried the oval MV beneath 6 layers of whitewash. When she cleaned it, she found 2 dates: 1,830, 8 and 1,849. Between them, almost erased, were the words, "Free days." Thomas lowered himself onto the opposite bench. Mondays and Thursdays. No charge for families from the lower lanes. Miriam Vale insisted on it, though the committee printed her husband's name on everything. Who was she? A widow who knew machines and herbs and had the misfortune to know them in public. Clara touched the shallow letters. Her father had not been searching for a pipe alone. He had been looking for a woman the town had deliberately rubbed away. By the first week of May, Clara had covered the ticket office wall with measured plans. The surviving west wing needed a new roof truss and repointing, but its outer walls remained plumb. The east parapet could be taken down safely without destroying the pools below. Her estimate showed that careful stabilization would cost £74, far beyond her means, but considerably less than demolition and removal. Henry Alden carried the estimate into a meeting of the local board. Vane called it the fantasy of an unqualified woman. Clara answered every question without raising her voice. Load paths, wall thicknesses, sound timbers, failed joints. When the board surveyor challenged her level readings, she placed her field book before him. He repeated 2 measurements the next day and obtained the same figures. The board granted a 21-day stay. Not from kindness, but because Alden had found a troubling entry in the parish minutes. In 1838, public subscriptions had established something called the Bellweather Clean Water and Baths Trust. Its governing schedule was missing. A later note said the schedule and boundary drawing had been lodged for safekeeping with Vane and Company Bank in 1862. "We have no such instrument," Vane said. The statement was too quick. Alden had not told him which instrument was missing. After the meeting, Vane waited beside Clara's gate with a bank draft for £25. It was enough to rent rooms for a year and preserve what remained of her mother's furniture. "You have demonstrated your point," he said. "No one can call you helpless now. You did. I spoke of your finances, not your character. You called me a debtor's daughter before men who had bought Sunday dinner from my father." Vane folded the draft. "Pride is an expensive tenant, Miss Whitmore. Then it should feel at home in your bank." His expression hardened. He said the stay would expire. The roof would fail, and every injury would be hers to answer for. Before leaving, he looked not at the cracked chimney or sagging wing, but toward the marble bench bearing Miriam Vale's initials. Clara moved the bench that evening. It required rollers, levers, and Thomas's patient curses. Beneath it lay no secret stair, only an iron service plate set flush with the tiles. 4 screws had fused with rust. Clara soaked them in paraffin and waited overnight rather than shear their heads. When the last screw turned, a breath of cold air rose through the gap. The shaft below was scarcely wide enough for her shoulders. She lowered a candle first. It burned steadily. A ladder of iron staples descended 9 feet to a narrow gallery, running behind the north wall, the width missing from the official plans. Thomas wanted to go first. Clara refused because the structure was hers to judge and because she had already noticed powdering mortar at the shaft head. She tied a rope around her waist and gave him the other end. The gallery was dry. Pipes of copper, lead, and cast iron crossed its ceiling in disciplined rows, each marked with a punched symbol rather than a word. 3 steps descending, 1 line rising, an oval around both. At the far end stood 2 iron pressure vessels beside a compact arrangement of clack valves and weighted arms. Clara stared until the candle grease reached her fingers. The machinery was not the ram itself. It was a receiving and regulating station. Somewhere higher on Marlow Hill, falling water drove a hydraulic ram. Each blow she heard was the waste valve closing. A smaller quantity of spring water then rose through the delivery pipe into a header vessel at the baths. Miriam Vale's regulating station separated air from the line and maintained pressure through the building. One pressure vessel still worked. Clara did not touch it. A corroded chamber under 22 feet of head could split with lethal force. She copied every mark, measured every branch, and traced the clear pipe to a stone valve table. A brass stroke counter beside it showed 18,411,206. The last digit advanced while she watched. Back in daylight, she calculated the ram's probable delivery from the interval between blows. Even at the lowest estimate, the line could produce more than 1,200 gallons a day. Not enough for all of Bellweather, but enough for bathing, laundry, and drinking water in the lower lanes. All that water, Thomas said, while they told us the supply had failed. A working pipe is not proof that anyone stole it. You sound like your father. He knew that being right and proving it were different labors. The gallery offered evidence of design but not ownership. Several plates carried the initials MV. One bore a maker's date of 1837 and the name of a Sheffield foundry. Near the northern end, an iron door blocked further passage. Its lock had been packed with lead, and a diagonal crack crossed the lintel above it. Clara would not let Thomas force it. Until the arch was shored, one hard blow might bring several tons of masonry down. The safer investigation led outside. The delivery pipe entered beneath the 11-foot strip omitted from Vane's deed schedule. Clara followed its line by temperature. At dawn, dew vanished first above the shallow portion. At noon, the earth there remained cooler than the surrounding ground. The route passed the 3 marked stones and continued under a public footpath toward a walled patch of alder and hawthorn on Marlow Hill. The enclosure belonged, according to the current rate book, to Marlow Development Company. Its directors were Alistair Vane and his brother-in-law, Josiah Craik, owner of the largest dye works in the district. Clara climbed the wall where fallen stones formed a rough stair. Inside she found a descending stream, an iron intake screen, and Thomas's fresh rake, marks in the silt. Water dropped through a stone culvert toward a low chamber buried under ferns. Every few seconds, a metallic concussion sounded beneath the ground. Thomas had cleared the screen each week because Edmund paid him to preserve the evidence. He had continued after Edmund's death because stopping the ram might have allowed its leather and brass valves to seize forever. You could have shown this to anyone, Clara said. I showed it to your father. Before him, I showed it to the council in '62. Mr. Vane's father told me it was an obsolete drainage engine and threatened me with dismissal. The chamber door was barred with a bank padlock less than a year old. Clara made drawings from outside and took water temperatures upstream and at the baths. When she returned the next morning with Alden, the padlock had been replaced by an iron plate bolted over the door. A notice accused trespassers of interfering with the private water supply of Marlow Development Company. Vane was no longer pretending the dead system did not exist. The board's stay expired on a Monday. At 7 that morning, 2 wagons arrived with ladders and sledgehammers. Alden met them at the gate with a temporary order obtained through his London correspondent from a vice-chancellor. The order did not recognize Clara's claim to the spring, but it forbade demolition until the missing trust schedule could be investigated. Vane read the paper twice. An order obtained on conjecture, on a parish record and a concealed hydraulic system. Alden replied, "A pipe is not a trust. Then you lose nothing by allowing us to look." The men left without unloading their hammers. Vane remained. "Your father came to me with the same suspicions," he told Clara. "He mistook old civic vanity for property law. The strain shortened his life." Clara felt the words like fingers closing around her throat. Edmund's last fever had followed weeks of exhaustion and secret journeys. She had wondered why his boots were often caked with pale hill clay. "Did you threaten him as you threaten me?" "I advised him to rest." "And when he would not?" Vane glanced toward the ticket office, where the leather survey case rested beneath Clara's desk. He made an unfortunate financial decision. That evening, Clara inspected the hidden gallery again. She had purchased timber with most of her recent earnings and braced the cracked lintel in pairs, setting wedges gradually so the old masonry would not take a sudden load. The iron door remained locked, but beneath its lower edge, she found a narrow brass strip green with age. It was a measuring scale. Unlike the plate on the valve table, it marked not pressure but flow. Small punch stars appeared beside two levels. Thomas remembered that on free days, attendants opened an additional standpipe in the courtyard. Clara adjusted the safe bypass valve by 1/4 turn. Water moved through a disused branch and murmured under the women's plunge pool. A row of blue floor tiles darkened as trapped dust rose through their joints. The tiles formed an arc around a circular stone plug. Clara and Thomas lifted it with a tripod and chain borrowed from Mrs. Pike's laundry. Beneath lay a second chamber, low enough that Clara had to crawl. Its walls were lined with glazed brick. 4 cylindrical filters stood along one side, packed in removable layers of gravel, charcoal, and fine sand. Along the other ran a distribution manifold with branches stamped for the courtyard, the pools, the laundry, and 3 street fountains. On the central manifold, the maker's plate gave a full name: Miriam Vale, Water Engineer, Bellweather, 1838. Someone had struck a chisel through the word engineer, but the letters remained readable. The chamber was the first undeniable evidence that Miriam had designed more than decoration. It also enlarged the mystery. A slate maintenance board recorded regular cleaning until September 1862, the month the baths closed. The next line, written in a different hand, ordered all public branches sealed, though the header line was to remain charged. There was no signature. Behind the filters, a narrow passage ended at the same iron door Clara had seen from the gallery. The chamber side had no lock. Only 2 wheel bolts joined to the pressure lines. One wheel was marked with 3 descending strokes, the other with 1 rising stroke. It was not a puzzle made for treasure hunters. It was an engineer's interlock. The door could be opened only after pressure on both sides had been equalized. Clara understood the principle, but not the condition beyond the door. If a buried conduit had collapsed, opening it could flood the chamber. She took readings at every valve and decided to wait. It was the correct decision. It was also the delay Vane needed. 2 days later, the Bellweather Chronicle printed an unsigned warning that water from the condemned baths might carry the same marsh poisons blamed for past fever. Customers canceled 3 of Clara's survey commissions. A brick struck the ticket office window after dark. On Sunday, the chapel minister advised parishioners not to confuse stubbornness with public service. Then June turned hot, and the pump in Tanner's Row began to smell of the privy yards uphill. Mrs. Pike brought the first sick child to Clara, a 7-year-old laundry girl named Bess, with gray lips and relentless vomiting. Clara was not a physician. She sent Thomas for Dr. Nathaniel Shaw and boiled every cup of water they gave the child. By evening, 4 more households reported the same illness. Dr. Shaw ordered the Tanner's Row pump chained until its well could be inspected. The nearest public pump stood half a mile away and already served 3 crowded streets. Women waited there with buckets until midnight. Clara possessed 1,200 gallons a day behind a closed valve. She also possessed a solicitor's warning. The Chancery order protected the building from demolition but did not authorize her to distribute water from a disputed source. Vane's notice claimed the spring for his company. If she opened the courtyard standpipe, he could accuse her of theft and endanger the case. Clara looked at Bess asleep on folded towels in the ticket office. Her father had taught her that a surveyor's first duty was not to a map, but to the people who trusted it. She opened the branch. The old standpipe coughed rust for several minutes. Clara discarded the first water, scrubbed its stone basin, and fitted a temporary filter box with new charcoal and sand. She posted a notice that every household should boil the water until the county analyst reported. Mrs. Pike organized the queue. Thomas measured each family's allowance, so the header vessel never emptied. Vane arrived before noon, with a constable and Josiah Craik. "Close it," Vane said. Clara handed the constable her sampling record, the pipe temperatures, and Dr. Shaw's written statement that the Tanner's Row well presented an immediate danger. If Mr. Vane wishes to remove clean water from sick children, he may turn the valve himself. Vane did not. Too many women were watching. Craik dipped a silver-topped cane into the basin and sneered at the pale mineral film. "Hill water ruins boilers and cloth." The complaint revealed more than he intended. A dye works owner had no reason to study the mineral content of a spring he considered worthless. For 9 days, the baths supplied the lower lanes. Clara spent £3 4 shillings on filter materials, buckets, and repairs money reserved for the cracked arch. The independent county analyst found the spring water low in organic contamination and fit for domestic use when properly stored. The Tanner's Row well, by contrast, received seepage from a broken drain. No one applauded Clara. Gratitude arrived in practical forms. A mason named Robert Fenn offered 2 days' labor on the north wall. Mrs. Pike sent hot meals. The chapel minister quietly replaced the broken ticket office glass. One skeptic, a butcher named Hale, continued carrying water from the distant pump and told anyone listening that trouble followed the Whitmore name. The bank's answer came as an injunction forbidding further distribution until ownership could be decided. Clara closed the standpipe rather than risk contempt. By then, the town pump had been repaired, and no more children were ill. That night, someone entered through the roof. Clara woke to falling plaster and reached the office in time to see a dark figure climb through the women's corridor. She followed as far as the courtyard, but loose rubble turned beneath her boots. The intruder escaped over the wall. Her father's leather survey case was gone. The thief had ignored her coins, the brass stroke counter rubbing, and Vane's £25 draft, which he had kept as evidence of his offer. He had taken Edmund's compass, field notebook, and the original receipt Thomas had given her. He had also poured lamp oil across Clara's water test records and set them alight in the stove. She smothered the flames with wet canvas, saving only the lower corner of one page. For the first time since the courthouse, she sat on the floor and wept. Not for the case, though her father had carried it for 30 years, but because she had kept the original receipt there out of sentiment, while filing only a hurried copy with Alden. At dawn, Thomas found a fresh cut on the roof lead and black grease on the courtyard wall. Bank carriage axles used the same heavy graphite grease as half the vehicles in Derbyshire. It proved nothing. Clara dried her face, redrew the lost pressure tables from memory, and wrote across the top of the new sheet, "Originals stay with Alden." Then she went into the hidden chamber. The 2 pressure wheels had moved during the night. Someone who knew the system had tried to open the iron door and stopped only when the unequal gauges warned of danger. Clara fitted a hasp to the service plate and slept with its key on a cord around her neck. She could not guard the roof, the spring enclosure, and 2 hidden entrances at once, but she could make interference visible. She painted fine lines across each valve joint. If a wheel moved, the lines would break. For the next fortnight, she shored the cracked arch in stages. Robert Fenn set new limestone jambs, while Clara calculated the load, and Thomas shaped oak wedges. They had nearly finished when Joseph Pritchard, Vane's narrow-shouldered bank clerk, arrived with a sealed notice. Clara remembered him holding the account book on the courthouse steps. He had stared at the ground while Vane insulted her. The notice authorized the local board's surveyor to inspect any pressurized apparatus that might endanger adjoining property. It did not permit cutting, removal, or entry without Clara present. Joseph waited while she read it. "Mr. Vane says the inspection will be Thursday," he murmured. "Then why have 6 men from Craik's works assembled beyond the hill?" Joseph's face changed, but only for an instant. "I deliver papers, Miss Whitmore. I do not arrange labor. They came before dawn on Wednesday. Thomas heard the wagon and reached the pump room first. By the time Clara ran from the ticket office, 2 men had lifted the service plate, and Josiah Craik stood above them with a saw. Vane held the notice Joseph had delivered. "The vessel is dangerously overcharged," Vane said. "We are relieving it." Clara saw that Craik's men had not touched the pressure vessel. They had set the saw against the clear delivery pipe. "That line is under 22 feet of head. Close the upper wastegate before you cut." Craik laughed. "A woman's 22 feet. Thomas climbed down to stop them. The first saw stroke scored the copper. The second opened a thin white jet. One of the workmen jumped back and struck a wheel valve with his heel. Its stem snapped. The pipe split. Water hit the gallery wall with the force of a hammer and knocked Thomas from the ladder. Clara caught his coat, but could not hold his full weight. He fell 6 feet onto the lower platform, his ankle turning beneath him. Craik's men scrambled out, leaving their tools as water climbed around Thomas's legs. Clara went down. She tied the safety rope under Thomas's arms and shouted for the men above to pull. Vane hesitated until Mrs. Pike, arriving with breakfast, seized the rope and ordered him out of her way. Together they dragged Thomas through the shaft. The pressure did not fall. The hydraulic ram on Marlow Hill continued to drive water into the broken line. Clara ran uphill, tore Vane's iron plate from one loosened bolt, and forced her arm through the gap until she found the wastegate lever. Rust tore her sleeve and skin. She pulled the lever down. The knocking beneath the hill stopped. By then, thousands of gallons had entered the hidden gallery. The temporary braces around the iron door held, but water washed lime from the older mortar. A section of the women's plunge floor dropped 18 inches. The ticket office wall cracked from sill to lintel. Clara's instruments, sample jars, and new field books floated in brown water. Thomas's ankle was broken. Dr. Shaw said he would walk again, though never without pain. The local board declared the baths an immediate hazard and gave Clara 10 days to prove that any portion could be saved. The Chronicle blamed reckless amateur interference with forgotten machinery. Vane petitioned to dissolve the chancery stay. Even some who had queued for water stepped away from Clara in the street. She stood alone in the ruined ticket office and measured the new crack. It was stable for the moment, but the repair would consume every penny she had. She had known the delivery pipe was brittle. She had planned a relief line and postponed it when Tanner's Row needed filters. Craik had caused the rupture. Yet Clara could not escape the knowledge that a safer system would have survived his ignorance. For one night, she considered Vane's draft. At dawn, Mrs. Pike found her beside the cold stove and tore the draft cleanly in half. "That water kept Bess alive," she said. "If you mean to surrender, do it without pretending. £25 is a reason." Clara was too tired to be offended. "I cannot rebuild a floor with gratitude." "No, but you can rebuild it with masons, and Bellweather contains more masons than bankers." 17 people came that morning. Not the whole town, and not without doubts. Robert Fenn brought shores from a quarry. The chapel minister brought a wagon. Women from Tanner's Row formed a line to empty silt from the gallery. Butcher Hale stood across the road predicting a burial until Mrs. Pike handed him a bucket. He refused and remained the town's last loud skeptic. Alden obtained another 14 days by showing the judge that Craik's men had exceeded the inspection notice. What he lacked was proof that Vane had intended the damage. Joseph Pritchard supplied it. He came after dark with 3 damp pages from the bank's letter-copying book. Vane's written instruction to Craik was dated the 13th of April, 1 day before he conveyed the baths to Clara and 3 weeks before anyone declared the pressure vessel dangerous. It ordered Craik to remove the North Delivery Branch before Whitmore traces the Vale schedule. Joseph's hands shook as Clara read. "He made me enter your father's debt," he said, "not the whole of it." Mr. Vane wrote the figure and signature. I copied the balance into the daybook. He said Mr. Whitmore had agreed to carry an old trust deficiency privately. When your father objected, Mr. Vane ordered me to replace the folio. Why tell me now? Joseph looked toward Thomas's empty chair. Because I held the book while he called a forgery your father's shame. And because Mr. Vane says the broken pipe was my error in drafting the notice. He had no original bank folio. Vane kept it locked in his private strongroom. He did have the numbered daybook counterfoils. 2 successive entries bore the same folio number. One charged Edmund Whitmore £418 and 12 shillings. The other cleared that exact sum from an account labeled BCWBT, Bellweather Clean Water and Baths Trust. The pages proved concealment and made Joseph a dangerous witness. They did not yet prove the trust's boundaries, terms, or surviving ownership. For that, Clara still needed what lay beyond the iron door. The water had equalized pressure on both sides, but she refused to profit from the accident by opening an unsupported vault. Under Robert's direction, they rebuilt the damaged arch with keyed stones and hydraulic lime. It took 11 days. Clara sold her mother's silver tea service to pay for timber and wages where volunteers lacked the means to give time freely. She kept an exact account of every hour and penny promised from any future recovery. When the mortar had cured enough to bear the temporary load, Clara returned to the chamber with Alden, Robert, Mrs. Pike, and the local board surveyor as witnesses. She reopened the hill intake by a fraction, adjusted the 2 wheels until the gauges matched, and released the iron dogs. The door moved inward without a groan. Beyond it lay a dry inspection vault built above the drainage invert. A second inner door had kept floodwater from entering. Its copper sill was packed with tarred oakum, and trays of exhausted quicklime had drawn damp from the air. On a stone shelf sat a Japan tin dispatch box wrapped in waxed linen. It bore the oval seal and the initials MV. No coins glittered when Alden lifted the lid. Clara felt relief. Inside were folded plans, account receipts, a bound water-testing notebook, and 3 deeds tied with faded blue tape. Miriam Vale's drawings showed the ram chamber, the filter beds, the 11-foot service easement, and the 3 public fountains. Every pipe symbol Clara had followed appeared in the key. The system had been designed to use the overflow of St. Anne's Spring, returning the ram's wastewater to the natural brook while lifting a portion to the baths. Miriam's notebook recorded outbreaks of bowel illness by street, season, and water source over 14 years. She had compared families using the hill supply with those drawing from shallow wells. She did not possess modern language for infection, but her conclusion was plain. Clean water and washing saved lives. Across one page she had written, "A clean cup must not depend upon a full purse." The first deed, executed in 1838, created the Bellweather Clean Water and Baths Trust from public subscriptions and land donated by Miriam. The second added St. Anne's Spring and its access easement. The third, signed in 1849, endowed maintenance with £500 in consols and named the lawful owner of the bathhouse as an operating trustee alongside 2 parish nominees. Vane had believed he was giving Clara a ruin. He had also made her the only surviving operating trustee. The papers alone were not enough. Alden warned that any document found on disputed land would be attacked as planted or incomplete. He traveled to Derby and returned with an enrolled memorial of the 1,838 deed from the county records. Its witness names, measurements, and seal description matched the original. The parish vestry produced a faded copy of the 1,849 endowment vote. Clara's boundary survey placed all 3 marked stones exactly where Miriam's schedule required, including the omitted 11-foot strip. The physical system supplied the final chain. The Sheffield foundry confirmed from its old order book that it had cast 4 regulating vessels to Miriam Vale's drawings in 1837. The stroke counter's rate matched her notebook within 2%. Water from the spring reached the baths at the head she had calculated 36 years before. Joseph's bank pages then acquired their meaning. The trust's dividends had been paid through Vane and Company after the baths closed. Instead of maintaining the property, Alistair Vane had transferred the income to Marlowe Development Company. Edmund discovered the old abbreviation while surveying drains near the hill and demanded the trust accounts. Vane converted the missing balance into a false personal debt, forged Edmund's signature, and seized his house after his death. Craik's interest was equally plain. His dye works planned a new finishing shed, and correspondence in Joseph's copy pages offered Marlowe Development the spring at a private rate once the baths were demolished and the trust boundary erased. Clara read every document twice. The discovery restored her father's honor, but it also hurt. Edmund had carried the investigation alone because he believed secrecy would protect her. In doing so, he had denied her the chance to help and left her to face his enemy without explanation. She placed Miriam's notebook beside Edmund's copied survey. Two capable people, separated by a generation, had both trusted solitary work more than human allies. Clara would not repeat that error. She gave Alden permission to make certified copies of everything. The originals went under joint seal to the county registrar. The plans were shown to the local board. Joseph signed a deposition before a magistrate, and Thomas gave his evidence from a chair with his injured leg on a stool. Vane responded by calling the entire discovery a conspiracy assembled by a resentful clerk, a ruined attendant, and an unmarried woman desperate for consequence. The bank's directors, frightened by claims against their institution, summoned an extraordinary meeting in Bellweather's assembly hall. Nearly everyone who had watched Clara lose her home returned to watch her answer. Vane stood beneath the gas lamps in a black coat, composed as ever. He conceded that an old charity might once have existed. He denied forging Edmund's debt and said any misapplied dividends were bookkeeping errors inherited from his father. His counsel argued that Clara's release barred her personal claim and that possession of the bathhouse did not grant ownership of water rising on Marlowe Development land. Alden began with the boundary stones. The 1,838 memorial gave their distances from the bathhouse pediment. Clara's measured plan placed them within inches. The spring enclosure lay inside the trust boundary, not Marlowe Development's later rate book parcel. The board surveyor described the hidden gallery and testified that its masonry, corroded plates, and sealed vault could not have been constructed in recent months. The foundry order corroborated Miriam's signed drawings. Dr. Shaw and the county analyst explained the difference between the spring and the contaminated Tanner's Row well. Then Joseph placed Vane's copied instruction on the table. "Why did you order the North Delivery branch removed before Miss Whitmore owned the baths?" Alden asked. "If you believed no active branch and no Vale schedule existed." Vane said Joseph had altered the date. The letter-copying book carried a continuous sequence of dated impressions on tissue-thin leaves. Entries before and after Vane's order were acknowledged by their recipients. Removing or replacing one leaf would have broken the binding thread. The date stood. Joseph next produced the duplicate daybook counterfoils. Vane called the repeated folio number a clerical error. Clara opened Edmund's account book to the disputed signature. Vane had brought the same volume, confident that her release made the forgery irrelevant. She laid beside it 6 survey certificates signed by her father over 20 years. Each date crossed its 7. Each signature ended firmly after the final R. The debt signature contained neither habit. That difference alone might have been dismissed. Combined with the trust entry for the identical sum, Joseph's testimony, Vane's concealed letter, and the threatened demolition, it became a pattern no respectable bank director could explain. The bank chairman asked Vane whether he had known that transferring the baths made Clara an operating trustee. For the first time, Vane looked directly at her with naked hatred. A technical absurdity. It was his answer. More than any apology could have been. The directors removed him before the meeting ended and surrendered the disputed books to the magistrates. A chancery order recognized the continuing trust, confirmed its boundaries, and set Clara's release aside because Vane had obtained it through fraudulent concealment. The bank restored her family home, repaid the diverted trust income with interest, and accepted liability for the flood damage. Edmund's supposed debt was struck from every account. Vane and Craik were later convicted of conspiracy to defraud and malicious destruction of trust property. Vane went to prison. Craik lost his development company shares, paid damages for Thomas's injury, and resigned from the local board. Joseph kept his liberty in return for full evidence, but no bank employed him again. Clara hired him months later to keep the Baths' accounts under the eye of all three trustees. Victory did not mend the roof. The recovered money amounted to less than rumor claimed, and Clara refused to spend it as if masonry obeyed a judgment. She closed the unstable east wing, rebuilt the west roof first, and reopened only the courtyard fountain while engineers renewed the pressure vessel. Robert Fenn's crew repaired one pool at a time. Every invoice was posted publicly beside Miriam Vale's original maintenance rules. 18 months after the courthouse auction, Bellweather Baths opened its west wing. It was not a palace. The men's warm room remained under scaffolding, and the grand boiler was beyond saving. A smaller, efficient boiler served 2 bathing rooms. Mrs. Pike managed a cooperative laundry in the old washhouse, employing 6 widows at regular wages. Dr. Shaw used a room on Tuesdays for a free infant clinic. Tanner's Row received a permanent fountain supplied through Miriam's filtered line, while household bath fees and laundry rents paid for fuel, attendance, and gradual repairs. Thomas returned as superintendent with a silver-topped cane and an intolerance for anyone who touched a valve without permission. Robert became the trust's maintenance mason. Butcher Hale never admitted that Clara had been right. He merely began filling his shop kettle at the new fountain. The entrance hall carried a limestone panel with Miriam Vale's full name and the words "Water Engineer" restored in letters no chisel could quietly erase. Beneath it hung Edmund Whitmore's corrected survey of the trust boundary. Clara moved back into her family house, though it no longer represented safety in the way it once had. She turned the front room into a survey office and took 2 apprentices, daughters of a plumber and a quarry foreman. She taught them to cross their sevens, keep original records in separate custody, and begin every map with the people who depended upon it. On free mornings, children raced across the bathhouse courtyard with towels under their arms. Clara often paused at the standpipe and rested her fingers against the copper branch concealed behind its stone casing. The hydraulic ram still struck beneath Marlow Hill. 3 descending measures carried into one rising line. Once, the sound had traveled through darkness as a warning. Now, clear water answered it in daylight.